things work properly. Oh, let me check something. Give me like 2 minutes. La, la, la.
I don't got fired tomorrow and I'm so happy I can just go home.
Sweet. Sweet,
Yeah.
sweet.
I forgot I only have like I forgot it was Wednesday. I thought it was
Yeah.
Thursday. I got so
I
excited that I
know.
got back
Yeah.
and I can go and I can just chill and relax
Same.
and then I checked the calendar and the calendar was like, hey, you know it's
Yeah.
like a middle of the week. Nope. Yeah, reality check, wake up and then I was just
Yeah.
I got Monday off, so
Oh yeah. Same. I think everyone does.
I'll be in Canada by Saturday.
Whoa.
yeah, my country we go.
Yeah. I'll be here by Saturday. Mm.
I'll still be here on Saturday.
Yeah.
I'll still be on Discord. After the
Yeah.
24th, I'll be free.
It's funny how you can stay in one place but actually not be in one place. Anyway, paradox. All right, yeah, let me know.
I'm ready whenever you are.
I am the same way. All right. Oh, I have to treat this book very carefully. Okay. So, a George Smiley novel by John le Carre, New York Times bestselling author of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Call for the Dead. Right. So then. Let's see. I'm gonna read this. Yeah, probably. I don't know if I should read that. Should I read this? Hold on. I'm trying to decide. Yeah, I'll read it. Introduction. John le Carre, March of 1992. With the possible exception of the person interviewed, there is nobody more predictable than an interviewer, and in my experience, they come in two sorts. I might almost say two ages. The over 40s look nervously at my grey locks and ask, in one way or another, how much longer can I last? The under 40s, who still have some hope for themselves as future writers, ask the other question, how did I get started? Call for the Dead is my first novel, so I will ignore the first question, which is anyway unanswerable, and tell you how I got started. I began writing because I was going mad with boredom. Not the apathetic, listless kind of boredom that doesn't want to get out of bed in the morning, but the screaming, frenetic sort that races around in circles looking for real work and finding none. I tried teaching backward children, and most of them were suffering from exactly what I was suffering from, boredom. They had sat at the back of their classes and been bored stiff. I tried teaching at Eton, but at Eton I often felt younger than the boys, and quite as much in need of a good tutor as they were. And I certainly wasn't ready to see straight down the corridor to the end of my life. Housemaster at 40, retirement at 60, cottage in Devon, and oh God, let me go. Please go gentle into that good night. While teaching, I had dabbed in commercial art during the school holidays, but not with much success. To satisfy me, everything I drew out or painted should have explained the meaning of life. But you don't get many opportunities to express your soul when you're knocking out children's book jackets at £8 a crack. As for writing, yes, since abandoning boyhood poetry, I'd had one shot. While I was still teaching at Eton, the Bodley Head asked me to write a German reader for them, to be aimed at the ordinary level examination students. So I wrote them a story about a pavement artist who one afternoon produced a masterpiece in pastels on a paving stone in Trafalgar Square, a Mona Lisa. Better, and he knew. Rain was coming, so was the rush hour. He had no fixative. The paving stone belonged to the council, not to him. My story was a nice little metaphor, now that I come to recall it, for my frustrated talent, even if I didn't know what talent it was that was lying on the ground unregarded by hurrying passers-by. Needless to say, the story was unsuited to the Bodley Head purposes, and they turned it down. Years later, Graham Greene, who was some kind of co-opted director of the Bodley Head, who published him, wrote to me suggesting that I go to them. But that's writers for you. I had not forgiven them, and I never will. Escaping from teaching, I re-entered the world of Whitehall's large back rooms and was soon working in a terribly secret building in the West End, which even the taxi drivers knew was M15. 5 days a week, I rose at 6, breakfast, walked half an hour to the railway station at Great Missenden, where I lived, rode the 65 minutes to Marylebone, and took the bus to Leconfield House in Curzon Street and showed my pass. Each evening I returned, sometimes not arriving home to my loyal wife and small son till 10 or 11 at night. The world I inhabited in London was a paper world. A security service marches on its files, and I was one of the infantry. Like Bob Cratchit in his tank, I toiled from morning and often till late into the evening at the dossiers of people I would never meet. Should we trust him or her? Should their employers trust them? Might be a traitor, spy, lonely decider, a suitable case for blackmail by the unscrupulous opposition. Thus I, who seemed to have no adult understanding of myself, was being asked to sit in judgment on the lives and loves of others. I was not versed in the ways of the real world, only of my own. The only tools I possessed were the possibilities of my own nature. These were of many sorts in those days, and the imaginative bridges that I built into my paper suspects earned me a reputation for, of all things, perspicuity. Nothing could have been further from the truth. What I was doing was inventing people out of the meagre clay of telephone taps, purloined mail, and investigators' reports. What else I gave my suspects came from myself. It wasn't good intelligence work, but in that mediocre world it could easily pass for such. And it turned out to be excellent training for the career I had not yet consciously embarked upon, namely, that of the novelist. The novelist, I know now, frequently regards his characters with the veiled mystification of a child among grown-ups. He views them with the same callousness and the same suspicion, the same pain, marvel, and the same fickle love. And as he watches them, he adds them to his secret bestiary, to admire, to imitate, to reject, to punish. For its inmates, the sheltered world of intelligence can be wonderfully conducive to preserving this childish vision. From inside its walls, we young recruits were able to regard ourselves as mature to a fault. But let us loose upon the grown-ups, and most of us were lost children. Which is precisely what Elsa Fenton tells George Smiley in Call for the Dead on the first occasion they met. In addition to my files, of course, I and my colleagues, and I never met such an odd bunch. The secret world is exactly the same as the real world, but, as Kostler said of the Jews, more so. The egregious Peter Wright walked our corridors, and perhaps, like me, he was unconsciously preparing himself for the literary career. Our senior officers hated each other for reasons we were not allowed to know. They hated our sister service even more. They hated politicians, communists, and quite a lot of journalists. And as we now know, they hated Harold Wilson and his kitchen cabinet. The nervousness of the place was eerie. Men who were close colleagues one day disappeared from sight the next, whether sacked or dispatched on some delicate mission, again we couldn't know. Usually turned out to be the sack. From these mysterious comings and goings, I later wove together the tale of Alec Leamis in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, whose sacking turned out to be a fiendish ploy. Alas, few in reality were. Great ability rubbed shoulders with breathtaking competence, and when you knew you were new, you never knew which to expect. For a while, you even wondered whether the fools were pretending to be fools, or some kind of wonderful deception, or whether there was a real, efficient Secret Service somewhere else. Later, in my fiction, I invented one. But alas, the reality was the mediocrity. Ex-colonel policemen mingled with failed academics, failed lawyers, failed missionaries, and failed debutantes gave our fabled canteen the amorphous quality of old-school outing on the Orient Express. Everyone seemed to smell a little of failure. With time, I began to believe that there was a service face after all, and that they all had it. A glance that catches yours, then looks downward, then away. Eyes that reach and then refuse. A separateness to each one of us, like those strange bubbles in the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch that never lets us kiss or touch. I later wrote about that too, in The Secret Pilgrim. Perhaps it was our secrets that kept us apart, the feeling that we knew more than our neighbour, or, oh Lord, less. Our secrets were our money, and the man who knew the most was the most conceited. Only on my occasional visits to the BBC, or at luncheons with great British newspapers, have I sensed something of the same malign, resentful atmosphere. But for the writer, in the making, who didn't even know that's what he was, this sad, secret world could scarcely have been bettered. John Bingham started me off, there is no doubt of it. John looked a bit like Smiley and wrote his thrillers in the lunch hour. Later he became, through no fault of his own, an earl, a transition I can never quite forgive in anybody with a sense of humour. He was one of the good ones all the same, earl or spy, a kindly, gracious, astute man, ex-journalist, ex-control commission, intelligence professional to his fingertips. And he reminded me of another and deeper influence in my early life, Vivian Green, who had been Champlain at my public school and ended his career triumphantly as rector of Lincoln College, Oxford. If I ever had a confessor, it was Green. And John Bingham, with his bumbly manners and shrewd eye and shrewder ear, was like an intelligence version of him. But where Vivian Green had written scholarly works on Wesley and the later Plantagenets, Bingham wrote fiction, and I watched him do it. His example was all I needed. I was ready to try my hand, and it is no surprise to me that when I came to invent my leading character, George Smiley, I should give him something of Vivian Green's unlikely wisdom, wrapped in academic learning, and something of Bingham's devious resourcefulness and simple patriotism also. All fictional characters are amalgams, or spring from much deeper wells than their apparent counterparts in life. All in the end, like the poor suspects in my files, are refitted and remoulded in the writer's imagination, until they are probably closer to his own nature than to anybody else's. But now that Bingham is dead, not to mention blown sky-high by self-styled historians of the service, it seems only right that I should acknowledge my debt to him, not merely as a component of George Smiley, but as the man who first put the spark to my writing career. I wrote in penny notebooks, on the train to and from Great Missenden, in lunch hours, in the grey morning hours before going off to work. Anne, my wife at the time, typed the stuff out. We were broke, but we risked at an Olivetti Portable on hire purchase at a few shillings a week. I put straight into the story, no messing with outlines, skeletons, or flowcharts. I had the smallest idea where I was going. But I had Smiley. I had my trays of files of men and women I was supposed to suspect, but I'd never met. And I had, in my memory, a little crushed Frenchwoman in the hospital at Chamonix when I had been skiing there soon after the war. She had been staying at my hotel, and when the manager told me she had broken not just one, but both her legs, I went to visit her. She was on her back, both legs in traction, a little scrap of a woman in her 50s with short peroxide hair and a fat lipstick mouth drawn over the small, little thin one underneath. She had been all through the resistance, she told me with a laugh. She had been parachuted into France. She forgot how many times. And she'd never broken anything till she went skiing. More laughter. And the hair, she explained excitedly, her hair, she now feared, would never grow properly again. She had spent the last year of the war in one of the camps, she said, as if she were talking of a few weeks on the Riviera. So, of course, they had shaved her head. Other people's hair had grown perfectly well, but hers, for some reason, as she told me with the same self-deprecating laugh, hers just hadn't. It didn't matter what you did to it, ointments, lotions, powders, you name it, they're all a flop. I pointed her my Elsa Fennon. When I had written the book, I feared that my troubles had just begun. I talked to nobody about the proprieties of writing a spy story while I was still inside the spy business, and nowadays, as I'm told, new entrants have to sign away their literary lives before they are allowed to join. Certainly I knew enough about these subterranean connections on my service not to attempt to publish without official consent. So I sent the book to the legal adviser, Bernard Hill, who had always seemed to me to be the dullest old stick-in-the-hole outfit, and he returned it a couple of days later with a note saying how much he had enjoyed it. He asked for one change, and I made it. Not for security reasons. He thought it might be libelous. He also asked me to use a pseudonym. I thought it was wiser, and sucking on his pipe, he wished me luck. When Victor Gollancz accepted the book, I asked Victor what sort of pseudonym I should choose. He recommended 2 Anglo-Saxon monosyllables, something like Chunk Smith or Hank Brown. I chose the Carrie. God alone knows why, or where I had it from, but I didn't like Victor's advice. When people press me, I say I saw the name on a shop front from the top of a London bus. I didn't. I just don't know. But never trust the novelist when he tells you the truth. Hang on. Let me adjust this really quickly. Because for some reason, things don't want to listen. There we go. Call for the Dead. Chapter 1. A brief history of George Smiley. When Lady Anne Succombe married George Smiley towards the end of the war, she described him to her astonished Mayfair friends as breathtakingly ordinary. When she left him 2 years later in favour of a Cuban motor racing driver, she announced enigmatically that if she hadn't left him then, she never could have done, and Viscount Sorley made a special journey to his club to observe that the cat was out of the bag. This remark, which enjoyed a brief season as a mutt, can only be understood by those who knew Smiley. Short, fat, and of a quiet disposition, he appeared to spend a lot of money on really bad clothes, which hung about his squat frame like skin on a shrunken toad. Sorley, in fact, declared at the wedding that Succombe was mated to a bullfrog in Sylvester. And Smiley, unaware of this description, had waddled down the aisle in search of the kiss that would turn him into a prince. Was he rich, or poor, peasant, or priest? Where had she got him from? The incongruity of the match was emphasized by Lady Anne's undoubted beauty, its mystery stimulated by the disproportion between the man and his bride. But gossip must see its characters in black and white, equip them with sins and motives easily conveyed in the shorthand of the conversation. And so, Smiley, without school, parents, regiment, or trade, without wealth or poverty, travelled without labels in the guard's van of Social Express, and soon became lost luggage, destined when the divorce had come and gone, to remain unclaimed on the dusty shelf of yesterday's news. When Lady Anne followed her star to Cuba, she gave some thought to Smiley. With grudging admiration, she admitted to herself that if there were an only man in her life, Smiley would be he. She was gratified in the retrospect that she had demonstrated this by holy matrimony. The effect of Lady Anne's departure upon her former husband did not interest society, which indeed is unconcerned with the aftermath of sensation. Yet it would be interesting to know that Sorley and his flock might have made of Smiley's reaction, of that fleshy, bespectacled face puckered in energetic concentration as he read so deeply among the lesser German poets, the chubby, wet hands clenched beneath the tumbling sleeves. But Sorley profited by the occasion with the merest of shrugs, remarking "partir c'est courir un peu," and he appeared to be unaware that though Lady Anne just ran away, a little George Smiley had indeed died. The part of Smiley which survived was as incongruous to his appearance as love, or a taste for unrecognized poets. It was his profession, which was that of intelligence officer. It was it was a profession he enjoyed, and which mercifully provided him with colleagues equally obscure in character and origin. It also provided him with what he once loved best in life: academic excursions into the mystery of human behavior, disciplined by the practical application of his own deductions. Sometime in the 20s, when Smiley had emerged from his unimpressive school and lumbered blinking into the murky cloisters of his unimpressive Oxford College, he had dreamed of fellowships and a life devoted to the literary obscurities of 17th century Germany. But his own tutor, who knew Smiley better, guided him wisely away from the honours that would undoubtedly have been his. On a sweet July morning in 1928, a puzzled and rather pink Smiley had sat before an interviewing board of the Overseas Committee for Academic Research, an organisation of which he had unaccountably never heard. Jebediah, his tutor, had been oddly vague about the introduction. "Give these people a try, Smiley. They might have you, and they pay badly enough to guarantee you decent company." But Smiley was annoyed and said no. It worried him that Jebediah, usually so precise, was so evasive. In a slight huff, he agreed to postpone his reply to All Souls until he had seen Jebediah's mysterious people. He wasn't introduced to the board, but he knew half of its members by sight. There was Fielding, the French medievalist from Cambridge, Spark from the School of Oriental Languages, the Steed Asprey who had been dining at high table the night Smiley had been Jebediah's guest. He had to admit, he was impressed. For Fielding to leave his rooms, let alone Cambridge, was in itself a miracle. Afterwards, Smiley always thought of that interview as a fan dance, a calculated progression of disclosures, each revealing different parts of a mysterious entity. Finally, Steed Asprey, who seemed to be chairman, removed the last veil, and the truth stood before him in all its dazzling nakedness. He was being offered a post in what, for want of a better name, Steed Asprey blushingly described as the Secret Service. Smiley had asked for time to think. They gave him a week. No one mentioned pay. That night, he stayed in London at somewhere rather good and took himself to the theatre. He felt strangely light-headed, and this worried him. He knew very well that he would accept, that he could have done so at the interview. It was only an instinctive caution, and perhaps a possible desire to play the coquette with Fielding, which prevented him from doing so. Following his affirmation came training. Anonymous country houses, anonymous instructors, a good deal of travel, and looming ever larger the fantastic prospect of working completely alone. His first operational posting was relatively pleasant, a 2-year appointment as English docent at a provincial German university, lectures on Keats and vacations in Bavarian hunting lodges with groups of earnest and solemnly promiscuous German students. Towards the end of each long vacation, he brought some of them back to England, having already earmarked the likely ones and conveyed his recommendations by clandestine means to an address in Bonn. During the entire 2 years, he had no idea whether his recommendations had been accepted or ignored. He had by no means of knowing even whether his candidates were approached. Indeed, he had no means of knowing whether his messages ever reached their destination, and he had no contact with the department while in England. His emotions in performing this work were mixed and irreconcilable. It intrigued him to evaluate from a detached position what he had learnt to describe as the agent potential of a human being, to devise minuscule tests of character and behaviour which could inform him of the qualities of a candidate. This part of him was bloodless and inhuman. Smiley, in this role, was the international mercenary of his trade, amoral and without motive beyond that of personal gratification. Conversely, It saddened him to witness it in himself, the gradual death of natural pleasure. Always withdrawn, he now found himself shrinking from the temptations of friendship and human loyalty. He guarded himself warily from spontaneous reaction. By the strength of his intellect, he forced himself to observe humanity with clinical objectivity, and because he was neither mortal nor infallible, he hated and feared the falseness of his life. But Smiley was a sentimental man, and a long exile strengthened his deep love of England. He fed hungrily on the memories of Oxford, its beauty, its rational ease, and the mature slowness of its judgment. He dreamt of wind-swept autumn holidays at Hartland Quay, of long trudges over the Cornish cliffs, his face smooth and hot against the sea wind. This was his other secret life, and he grew to hate the bawdy intrusion of the new Germany, the stamping and shouting of uniformed students, the scarred, arrogant faces and their cheap jack answers. He resented, too, the way in which the faculty had tampered with his subject, his beloved German literature. And there had been a terrible night in the winter of 1937, when Smiley had stood at his window and watched the great bonfire in the university court. Round it stood hundreds of students, their faces exultant and glistening in the dancing light. And into the pagan fire they threw books in their hundreds. He knew whose books they were. Thomas Mann, Heine, Lessing, and a host of others. And Smiley, his damp hand cupped around the end of his cigarette, watching and hating, triumph that he knew his enemy. 1939 saw him in Sweden, the accredited agent of a well-known Swiss small arms manufacturer, his association with the firm conveniently backdated. Conveniently, too, his appearance had somehow altered, for Smiley had discovered himself a talent for the part which went beyond the rudimentary change to his hair and the addition of a small moustache. For 4 years he had played the part, travelling back and forth between Switzerland, Germany, and Sweden. He had never guessed it was possible to be frightened for so long. He developed a nervous irritation in his left eye, which remained with him 15 years later. The strain etched lines on his fleshy cheeks and brow. He learnt what it was never to sleep, never to relax, to feel at any time of day or night the restless beating of his own heart, to know the extremes of solitude and self-pity, the sudden unreasoning desire for a woman, for drink, for exercise, for any drug to take away the tension of his life. Against this background, he conducted his authentic commerce and his work as a spy. The progress of time, the network grew, and other countries repaired their lack of foresight and preparation. In 1943, he was recalled. Within 6 weeks, he was yearning to return, but they never let him go. "You're finished," Steed Asprey said. "Train new men, take time off, get married or something. Unwind." Smiley proposed to Steed Asprey's secretary, the Lady Anne Sacombe. The war was over. They paid him off and took his beautiful wife to Oxford to devote himself to the obscurities of 17th century Germany. But 2 years later, Lady Anne was in Cuba, and the revelations of a young Russian cipher clerk in Ottawa had created a new demand for men as Smiley's experience. The job was new, the threat elusive, and at first he enjoyed it. But the younger men were coming in, perhaps with fresher minds. Smiley was no material for promotion, and it dawned on him gradually that he had entered middle age without ever being young, and that he was, in the nicest possible way, on the shelf. Things changed. Steed Asprey was gone, fled from the New World to India in search of another civilization. Jebediah was dead. He had boarded a train at Lille in 1941 with his radio operator, a young Belgian, and neither had been heard of again. Fielding was wedded to a new thesis on Roland. Only Maston remained, Maston, the career man, the wartime recruit, the minister's advisor on intelligence. The first man, Jebediah had said, to play power tennis at Wimbledon. The NATO alliance and the desperate measures contemplated by the Americans altered the whole nature of Smiley's service. Gone forever were the days of Steed Asprey, when as like as not you took your orders over a glass of port in his rooms at Magdalen. The inspired amateurism of a handful of highly qualified, underpaid men had given way to the efficiency, bureaucracy, and intrigue of a large government department, effectively at the mercy of Maston, with his expensive clothes and his knighthood, his distinguished grey hair and silver-coloured ties. Maston, who remembered his secretary's birthday, whose manners were by a word among the ladies of the registry. Maston, apologetically extending his empire and regrettably moving to even higher offices. Maston holding smart house parties at Henley and feeding on the success of his subordinate. They had brought him in during the war, the professional civil servant from an orthodox department, a man to handle paper and integrate the brilliance of his staff with the cumbersome machine of bureaucracy. It comforted the great to deal with a man they knew, a man who could reduce any colour to grey, who knew his masters and could walk among them. And he did it so well. They liked his diffidence when he apologized for the company he kept, his insincerity when he defended the vagaries of his subordinates, his flexibility when formulating new commitments. Nor did he let go the advantages of a cloak and dagger man, malgré lui, wearing the cloak for his masters and preserving the dagger for his servants. Ostensibly, his position was an odd one. He was not the nominal head of service, but a minister's advisor on intelligence. Instead, Asprey had described him for all time as the head eunuch. This is a new world for Smiley. The brightly lit corridors, the smart young men. He felt pedestrian, old-fashioned homesick for the dilapidated terrace house in Knightsbridge where it had all begun. His appearance seemed to reflect this discomfort in a kind of physical recession which made him more hunched and frog-like than ever. He blinked more and acquired the name of Mole. But his debutante secretary adored him and referred to him invariably as my darling teddy bear. Smiley was now too old to go abroad. Maston made that clear. Anyway, my dear fellow, as like as you are not blown after all the ferreting about in the war, better stick at home, old man, and keep the home fires burning. Which goes some way to explaining why George Smiley sat in the back of a London taxi at 2 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday, the 4th of January, on his way to Cambridge Circus. 2. We never closed. He felt safe in the taxi. Safe and warm. The warmth was contraband, smuggled from his bed and hoarded against the wet January night. Safe because unreal. It was his ghost that ranged the London streets and took note of the unhappy pleasure-seekers scuttling under commissaries, umbrellas, and that of the tarts gift-wrapped in polythene. It was his ghost, he decided, which had climbed from the well of sleep and stopped the telephone shrieking on the bedside table. Oxford Street. Why was London the only capital in the world that lost its personality at night? Smiley, as he pulled his coat more closely about him, could think of nowhere, from Los Angeles to Bern, which so readily gave up its daily struggle for identity. The cab turned into Cambridge Circus, and Smiley sat up with a jolt. He remembered why the duty officer had rung, and the memory woke him brutally from his dreams. The conversation came back to him, word for word, a feat of recollection long ago achieved. Duty officer speaking. Smiley. I have the advisor on line. Smiley! Maston speaking. You interviewed Samuel Arthur Fenton at the Foreign Office on Monday, am I right? Yes. Yes, I did. What was the case? Anonymous letter alleging party membership at Oxford. Routine interview, authorized by the Director of Security. Fennan can't have complained, thought Smiley. He knew I'd clear him. There was nothing irregular. Nothing. Did you go for him at all? Was it hostile, Smiley? Tell me that. Lord, he does sound frightened. Fennan must have put the whole cabinet onto us. No, it was a particularly friendly interview. We liked one another, I think. As a matter of fact, I exceeded my brief in a way. How, Smiley, how? Well, I more or less told him not to worry. What? I told him not to worry. He was obviously in a bit of a state, and so I told him. What did you tell him? I said I had no powers and nor had the service, but I could see no reason why we shouldn't bother him further. Is that all? Smiley paused for a second. He had never known Maston like this, never known him so dependent. Yes, that's all. Absolutely all. He'll never forgive me for this. So much of the studied calm, the cream shirts and silver ties, these smart luncheons with ministers. He says you cast doubts on his loyalty, that his career in the FO is ruined, that he is the victim of paid informers. He said what? I was gone stark mad. He knows he's cleared. What else does he want? Nothing. He's dead. Killed himself at 10:30 this evening. Left a letter to the Foreign Secretary. The police rang one of his secretaries and got permission to open the letter. They told us there's going to be an inquiry. Smiley, you're sure, aren't you? Sure of what? Never mind. Get round as soon as you can. It had taken him hours to get a taxi. He rang 3 cab ranks and got no reply. At last the Sloane Square rank replied, and Smiley waited at his bedroom window wrapped in his overcoat until he saw the cab draw up at the door. It reminded him of the air raids in Germany, this unreal anxiety in the dead of night. At Cambridge Circus, he stopped the cab 100 yards from the office, partly from habit and partly to clear his head in anticipation of Maston's febrile questioning. He showed his pass to the constable on duty and made his way slowly to the lift. The duty officer greeted him with relief as he emerged, and they walked together down the bright cream corridor. Maston's gone to see Sparrow at Scotland Yard. There's a squabble going on about which police department handles the case. Sparrow says Special Branch, Evelyn says CID, and the Surrey police don't even know what's hit them. Bad as a will. Come and have coffee in the DO's glory hole. It's out of a bottle, but it does. Smiley was grateful it was Peter Gwillim's duty that night. A polished and thoughtful man who had specialised in subtle espionage, the kind of friendly spirit who always had a timetable and a penknife. Special Branch rang at 12:05. Fennan's wife went to the theatre, and I didn't find him till she got back alone at 10:45. She eventually rang the police. He lived down in Surrey somewhere. Wollaston, off the Kensington bypass, only just outside the metropolitan area. When the police arrived, they found a letter to the Foreign Secretary on the floor besides the body. The superintendent rang the chief constable, who rang the duty officer at the Home Office, who rang the resident clerk at the Foreign Office, and eventually they got permission to open the letter. Then the fun started. Go on. The Director of Personnel at the Foreign Office rang us. He wanted the advisor's home number, said this was the last time security tampered with his staff, that Fennan had been a loyal and talented officer, blah, blah, blah. So it was. Said the whole affair demonstrated conclusively that security had got out of hand. Gestapo methods which were not even mitigated by a genuine threat, blah. I gave him the advisor's number and dialed it on the other phone while he went on raving. By a stroke of genius, I got the FO off one line and Maston on the other and gave him the news. That was at 12:20. Maston was here by 1 in a state of advanced pregnancy. I have to report to the minister tomorrow morning. They were silent for a moment. while Gwilym poured coffee essence into the cups and added boiling water from the electric kettle. "What was he like?" he asked. "Who? Fennon? Well, until tonight I could have told you. Now it doesn't make sense. To look, it's obviously a Jew. Orthodox family, but dropped all that at Oxford and turned Marxist. Perceptive, cultured. A reasonable man. Soft-spoken, good listener. Still educated, facts galore. Whoever denounced him was right, of course. He was in the party." "How old?" 44. Looks older, really." Smiley went on talking as his eyes wandered round the room. Sensitive face, mop of straight, dark hair undergraduate fashion, a profile of a 20-year-old, fine, dry skin, rather chalky. Very lined, too, lines going all ways, cutting the skin into squares. Very thin fingers, compact sort of chap, self-contained unit. Takes his pleasures alone. Suffered alone, too, I suppose. They got up as Maston came in. "Oh, Smiley! Come in!" He opened the door and put out his left arm to guide Smiley through first. Maston's room contained not a single piece of government property. He had once bought a collection of 19th century watercolours, and some of these were hanging on the walls. The rest was off the peg, Smiley decided. Maston was off the peg too, for that matter. His suit was just too light for respectability, the string of his monocle cut across the invariable cream shirt. He wore a light grey woolen tie. A German would call him flott, thought Smiley. Chic. That's what he is, a barmaid's dream of a real gentleman. "I've seen Sparrow. It's a clear case of suicide. The body has been removed, and beyond the usual formalities, the chief constable is taking no action. There'll be an inquest within a day or two. They've been agreed, I can't emphasize this too strongly, Smiley, that no word of our formal interest in Fennon is to be passed to the press." "I see. You're dangerous, Maston, you weak and frightened. Anyone's neck before yours, I know. You're looking at me that way, measuring me for the rope." "Don't think I'm criticizing, Smiley. After all, if the Director of Security authorized the interview, you have nothing to worry about." "Except Fennon." "Quite so. Unfortunately, the Director of Security omitted to sign off your minute suggestion at interview." "He authorized it verbally, no doubt?" "Yes, I'm sure he'll confirm that." Maston looked at Smiley again, sharp, calculating. Something was beginning to stick in Smiley's throat. He knew he was being uncompromising, that Maston wanted him nearer, wanted him to conspire. "You know, Fennon's office have been in touch with me." "Yes." "There will have to be an inquiry. It may not even be possible to keep the press out. I shall certainly have to see the Home Secretary first thing tomorrow. Frighten me and try again. I'm getting on, pension to consider, employable too, but I won't share your lie, Maston." "I must have all the facts, Smiley. I must do my duty. If there's anything you feel you should tell me about the interview, anything you haven't recorded perhaps, tell me now and let me be the judge of its significance." "There's nothing to add, really, to what's already on the file and what I told you earlier tonight. It might help you to know. To you was a trifle long, perhaps. It might help you to know that I conducted the interview in an atmosphere of exceptional informality. The allegation against Fennon was pretty thin, university membership in the 30s and vague talk of current sympathy. Half the cabinet were in the party in the 30s. Maston frowned. When I got to his room in the Foreign Office, it turned out to be rather public. People trotting in and out the whole time, so I suggested we should go out for a walk in the park. "Go on." "Well, we did. It was a sunny, cold day and rather pleasant. We watched the ducks." Maston made a gesture of impatience. "We spent about half an hour in the park. He did all the talking. He was an intelligent man, fluent and interesting, but nervous, too, not naturally. These people love talking about themselves, and I think he was pleased to get it off his chest." He told me the whole story. Seemed quite happy to mention names, and then we went to an espresso cafe he knew near Millbank. Oh, what? An espresso bar. They sell a special kind of coffee for $1 a cup. We had some. I see. It was under these inconvivial circumstances that you told him the department would recommend no action. Yes, we often do that, but we don't normally record it. Master nodded. That was the kind of thing he understood, thought Smiley. Oh, goodness me, he really is rather contemptible. It was exciting to find Master being as unpleasant as he expected. And I may take it, therefore, that his suicide and his letter, of course, come as a complete surprise to you? You find no explanation? It would be remarkable if I did. You have no idea who denounced him? No. He was married, you know? Yes. I wonder. It seems conceivable that his wife might be able to fill in some of the gaps. I hesitate to suggest it, but perhaps someone from the department ought to see her, and so far as good feeling allows, question her on all this. No? Smiley looked at him, expressionless. Maston was standing at his big flat desk, toying with the businessman's cutlery, paper knife, cigarette box, lighter, the whole chemistry set of official hospitality. He's showing a full inch of cream cuff, thought Smiley, and admiring his white hands. Maston looked up, his face composed an expression of apathy. Smiley, I know how you feel, but despite this tragedy, you must try to understand the position. The Minister and the Home Secretary will want the fullest possible account of this affair, and it is my specific task to provide one. Particularly any information which points to Fennon's state of mind immediately after his interview with us. Perhaps he spoke to his wife about it. He's not supposed to have done that, but we must be realistic. You want me to go down there? Someone must. There's a question of the inquest. The Home Secretary still will have to decide about that, of course, but at present we just haven't the facts. Time is short. You know the case. You made the background inquiries. There's no time for anyone else to brief himself. If anyone goes, it will have to be you, Smiley. When do you want me to go? Apparently, Mrs. Fennon is a somewhat unusual woman. Foreign, Jewish too, I gather. Has suffered badly in the war, which adds to the embarrassment. She's a strong-minded woman, and relatively unmoved by her husband's death. Only superficially, no doubt. But sensible and communicative. I gather from Sparrow that she is proving cooperative and would probably see you as soon as you can get there. Surrey police can warn her you're coming, and you can see her first thing in the morning. I shall telephone you there later in the day. Smiley turned to go. Oh, and Smiley... He felt Maston's hand on his arm and turned to look at him. Maston wore the smile normally reserved for the older ladies of the service. Smiley, you can count on me, you know? You can count on my support. My God, thought Smiley, you really do work round the clock. A 24-hour cabaret you are. We never closed. He walked out into the street. 3. Elsa Fennon. Merridale Lane is one of those corners of Surrey where the inhabitants wage a relentless battle against the stigma of suburbia. Trees, fertilized and cajoled into being in every front garden, half obscure the poky character dwellings which crouch behind them. The rusticity of the environment is enhanced by the wooden owls that keep guard over the names of houses and by crumbling dwarfs indefatigably poised over goldfish ponds. The inhabitants of Merridale Lane do not paint their dwarfs, suspecting this to be a suburban vice, nor for the same reason do they varnish the owls, but wait patiently for the years to endow these treasures with an appearance of weathered antiquity, until one day even the beams in the garage may boast a beetle and worm. The lane is not exactly a cul-de-sac, although estate agents insist that it is. The further end of the Kingston bypass dwindles nervously into a gravel path, which in turn degenerates into a sad little mud track across Marysfield, leading into another lane indistinguishable from Merridale. Until about 1920, this path had led to the parish church, but the church now stands on what is virtually a traffic island adjoining the London Road, and the path which once led the faithful worship provides a superfluous link between the inhabitants of Merridale Lane and Cadogan Road. The strip of open land called Marysfield has already achieved an eminence far beyond its own aspirations. It has given a wedge deep into the district council between the developers and the preservers, and so effectively that on one occasion the entire machinery of the local government of Wollaston was brought to a standstill. A kind of natural compromise has now established itself. Marysfield is neither developed nor preserved by the three-wheel pylons placed at regular intervals across it. At the centre is a cannibal hut with a thatched roof called the War Memorial Shelter, erected in 1951 in grateful memory to the fallen of two wars, as a haven for the weary and old. No one seems to have asked what business the weary and the old would have had in Marysfield, but the Spiders at least found a haven in the roof, and as a sitting-out place for pylon builders, the hut was unusually comfortable. Smiley arrived there on foot just after 8 that morning, having parked his car at the police station, which was 10 minutes' walk away. It was raining heavily, driving cold rain, so cold it felt hard upon the face. Surrey police had no further interest in the case, but Sparrow had sent down independently a special branch officer to remain at the police station and act if necessary as a liaison between the security and the police. There was no doubt about the manner of Fennon's death. He had been shot to the temple at point-blank range by a small French pistol manufacturer in Lille in 1957. The pistol was found beneath the body. All the circumstances were consistent with suicide. Number 15 Merridale Lane was a low Tudor-style house with the bedrooms built into gables and a half-timbered garage. It had an air of neglect, even disuse. It might have been occupied by artists, thought Smiley. Fennon didn't seem to fit here. Fennon was Hampstead, an au pair foreign girls. He unlatched the gate and walked slowly up the drive to the front door, trying vainly to discern some sign of life through the leaded windows. It was very cold. He rang the bell. Elsa Fennon opened the door. They rang and asked me if I minded. I didn't know what to say. Please come in. A trace of a German accent. She must have been older than Fennon. A slight, fierce woman with hair cut very short and dyes the colour of nicotine. Although frail, she conveyed an impression of endurance and courage, and the brown eyes that shone from a crooked little face were of an astonishing intensity. It was a worn face, racked and ravaged long ago, the face of a child grown old on starving and exhaustion, the eternal refugee face, the prison camp face, thought Smiley. She was holding out her hand to him. It was scrubbed and pink, bony to the touch. He told her his name. "You're the man who interviewed my husband," she said. "About loyalty." She led him into the low, dark drawing room. There was no fire. Smiley felt suddenly sick and cheap. Loyalty to whom? To what? She didn't sound resentful. He was an oppressor, but she accepted oppression. "I liked your husband very much. He would have been cleared." "Cleared? Cleared of what?" "There was a prima facie case for investigation, an anonymous letter. I was given the job." He paused and looked at her with real concern. "You have had a terrible loss, Mrs. Fennon. You must be exhausted. You can't have slept all night. She did not respond to his sympathy. Thank you, but I can scarcely hope to sleep today. Sleep is not a luxury I enjoy. She looked down wryly at her own tiny body. My body and I must put up with one other 20 hours a day. We lived longer than most people already. As for the terrible loss, yes, I suppose so. But you know, Mr. Smiley, for so long I owned nothing but a toothbrush, and so not really used to possession, even after 8 years of marriage. Besides, I have the experience to suffer with discretion. She bobbed her head at him, indicating that he might sit. With an oddly old-fashioned gesture, she swept her skirt beneath her and sat opposite him. It was very cold in that room. Smiley wonders whether he ought to speak. He dared not look at her, but peered vaguely before him, trying desperately in his mind to penetrate the worn, travelled face of Elsa Fennon. It seemed a long time before she spoke again. You said you liked him. You didn't give him that impression, apparently. I haven't seen your husband's letter, but I have heard of its content. Smiley's earnest, pouchy face was turned towards her now. It simply doesn't make sense. I as good as told him that we would recommend that the matter be taken no further. She was motionless, waiting to hear. What could he say? I'm sorry I killed your husband, Mrs. Fennon, but I was only doing my duty. Duty to whom, for God's sake? He was in the Communist Party at Oxford 24 years ago. His recent promotion gave him access to highly secret information. Some busybody wrote us an anonymous letter, and we had no option but to follow it up. The investigation induced a state of melancholia in your husband and drove him to suicide. He said nothing. It was a game, she said suddenly. A silly balancing trick of ideas. Nothing to do with him or any real person. Why do you bother yourself with us? Go back to Whitehall and look for more spies on your drawing boards. She paused, showing no sign of emotion beyond the burning of her dark eyes. It's an old illness you suffer from, Mr. Smiley, she continued, taking a cigarette from the box. And I have seen many victims of it. The mind comes separated from the body. It thinks without reality, rules a paper kingdom, and divides without emotion the ruin of the paper victims. But sometimes the division between your world and ours is incomplete. The files grow heads and arms and legs. That's a terrible moment, isn't it? The names have families as well as records, and human motives to explain the sad little dossiers and the make-believe sins. When that happens, I am sorry for you. She paused for a moment and continued. It's like the state and the people. State is a dream too, a symbol of nothing at all, an emptiness, a mind without a body, a game played with clouds in the sky. But states make war, don't they? And imprison people. To dream and doctrines, how tidy. My husband and I have both been tidy now, haven't we? She was looking at him steadily. Her accent was more noticeable now. You call yourself the state, Mr. Smiley. You have no place among real people. You dropped a bomb from the sky. Don't want to come down here and look at the blood or hear the scream. She had not raised her voice. She looked above him now and beyond. You seem shocked. I should be weeping, I suppose, but I've no more tears, Mr. Smiley. I'm barren. The children of my grief are dead. Thank you for coming, Mr. Smiley. You go back now. There's nothing you can do here. He sat forward in his chair, his podgy hands nursing one another on his knees. He looked worried and sanctimonious, like a grocer reading the lesson. The skin of his face was white and glistened at the temples and on the upper lip. Only under his eyes was there any colour, mauve, half-moons bisected by the heavy frame of his spectacles. Look, Mrs. Fenton, the interview was almost a formality. I think your husband enjoyed it. I think it even made him happy to get it over. How can you say that? How can you... Now this... But I tell you, it's true. Why, we didn't even hold the thing in a government office. When I got there, I found Fennon's office a sort of right-of-way between two other rooms, so we walked out into the park and finished up at a cafe. Scarcely an inquisition, you see. I even told him not to worry. I told him that. I just don't understand the letter. It doesn't... It's not the letter, Mr. Smiley, that I'm thinking of. It's what he said to me. How do you mean? He was deeply upset by the interview. He told me so. When he came back on Monday night, he was desperate, almost incoherent. He collapsed in a chair, and I persuaded him to go to bed. I gave him a sedative, which lasted him half the night. He's still talking about it the next morning. It occupied his whole mind until his death. The telephone was ringing upstairs. Smiley got up. Excuse me. There will be my office. Do you mind? It's in the front bedroom, directly above us. Smiley walked slowly upstairs in a state of complete bewilderment. What on earth should he say to Maston now? He lifted the receiver, glancing mechanically at the number on the apparatus. Wollaston, 2944. Exchange here. Good morning. Your 8:30 call. Oh yes. Thank you very much. He rang off, grateful for the temporary respite. He glanced briefly round the bedroom. It was the Fennons' own bedroom, austere but comfortable. There were two armchairs in front of the gas fire. Smiley remembered how that, now, Elsa Fennon had been bedridden for 3 years after the war. It was probably a survival from those years that they still sat in the bedroom in the evenings. The alcoves on either side of the fireplace were full of books. In the furthest corner, a typewriter on a desk. There was something intimate and touching about the arrangement, and perhaps for the first time Smiley was filled with an immediate sense of the tragedy of Fennon's death. He turned to the drawing room. It was for you, your 8:30 call from the exchange. He was aware of a pause and glancing curiously towards her, but she had turned away from him and was standing looking out of the window, her slender back very straight and still, her stiff, short hair dark against the morning light. Suddenly, he stared at her. Something had occurred to him which he should have realized upstairs in the bedroom, something so improbable that for a moment his brain was unable to grasp it. Mechanically, he went on talking. He must get out of there, get away from the telephone and Maston's hysterical questions, get away from Elsa Fennon and her dark, restless house. Get away and think. I have intruded too much already, Mrs. Fennon, and I must now take your advice and return to Whitehall. Again, the cold, frail hand, the mumbled expressions of sympathy. He collected his coat from the hall and stepped out into the early sunlight. The winter sun had just appeared for a moment after the rain, and repainted in pale, wet colours the trees and houses of Merridale Lane. The sky was still dark grey, and the world beneath it strangely luminous, giving back the sunlight it had stolen from nowhere. He walked slowly down the gravel path, fearful of being called back. He returned to the police station, full of disturbing thoughts. To begin with, It was not Elsa Fenton who had asked the exchange for an 8:30 call that morning. Four. Coffee at the fountain. The CID superintendent at Wollaston was a large, genial soul who measured professional competence in years of service and saw no fault in the habit. Sparrow's Inspector Mendel, on the other hand, was a thin, weasel-faced gentleman who spoke very rapidly out of the corner of his mouth. Smiley secretly likened him to a gamekeeper, a man who knew his territory and disliked intruders. "I have a message from your department, sir. You're to ring the advisor at once." The superintendent indicated his telephone with an enormous hand and walked out through the open door of his office. Mendel remained. Smiley looked at him owlishly for a moment, guessing this man. "Shut the door." Mendel moved to the door and pulled it quietly to. "I want to make an inquiry of the Wollaston Telephone Exchange. Who's the most likely contact?" "Assistant supervisor normally. Supervisor's always in the clouds. Assistant supervisor does the work." "Someone at 15 Meridale Lane asked to be called by the exchange at 8:30 this morning. I want to know what time the request was made and who by. I want to know whether there's a standing request for a morning call, and if so, let's have the details." Another number. "Wollaston 2944. Subscriber Samuel Fenton, I should think." Mendel moved to the telephone and dialed 0. While he waited for a reply, he said to Smiley, "You don't want anyone to know about this, do you?" "No one. Not even you. There's probably nothing in it. If we start bleating out murder, we'll—" Mendel was through to the exchange, asking for the assistant supervisor. "Wollaston CID, superintendent's office, open inquiry." "Yes, of course. Ring back then. CID, outside line, Wollaston 2421. He replaced the receiver and waited for the exchange to ring him. "Sensible girl," he muttered, without looking at Smiley. The telephone rang and began speaking at once. "We're investigating a burglary in Meridale Lane, number 18. It's possible they used number 15 as an observation point for a job at the opposite house. Have you got any way of finding out whether calls were originated or received on Wollaston 2944 in the last 24 hours? There was a pause. Mendel put his hand over the mouthpiece and turned to Smiley with a very slight grin. Smiley suddenly liked him a good deal. "She's asking the girls," said Mendel. "I should look at the dockets." He turned back to the telephone and began jotting down figures on the superintendent's pad. He stiffened abruptly and leaned forward on the desk. "Oh, yes." His voice was casual in contrast to his attitude. "I wonder when she asked for that." Another pause. 1955 hours. "Manor. Girl show there, is he? Oh, I see. Oh, well, that fixes things. Thanks very much indeed, all the same. Well, at least we know where we stand. Oh, not at all. We'd be very helpful. Just a theory, that's all. Have to think again, will we? Well, thanks very much. Very kind. Keep it on your hat. Cheerio." He rang off, tore the page from the pad, and put it in his pocket. Smiley spoke quickly. "There's a beastly cafe down the road. I need some breakfast. Come and have a cup of coffee." The telephone was ringing. Smiley could almost feel Maston on the other end. Mendel looked at him for a moment and seemed to understand. They left it ringing and walked quickly out of the police station towards the high street. The Fountain Cafe, proprietor Miss Gloria Adam, was all Tudor and horse brasses and local honey at 6 pence more than anywhere else. Miss Adam herself dispensed the nastiest coffee south of Manchester and spoke of her customers as "my friends." Miss Adam did not do business with friends, but simply robbed them, which somehow added to the illusion of genteel amateurism which Miss Adam was so anxious to preserve. Her origin was obscure, but she often spoke of her late father as the Colonel. It was rumoured among those of Miss Adams' friends who had paid particularly dear for their friendship that the colonelcy in question had been granted by the Salvation Army. Mendel and Smiley sat at a corner table near the fire. Waiting for their order, Mendel looked at Smiley oddly. The girl remembers the call clearly. Came right at the end of the first shift, 7:55 last night. A request for an 8:30 call this morning, made by Fenton himself. The girl is positive of that. How? Apparently, this Fenton had rung the exchange on Christmas Day, and the same girl was on duty. I want to wish them all a happy Christmas. She rather bucked. Made quite a chat. She's sure it was the same voice yesterday, asking for the call. Very uncultured gentleman, she said. But that doesn't make sense. He wrote a suicide letter at 10:30. What happened between 8 o'clock and 10:30? Mendel picked up a battered old briefcase. It had no lock, more like a music case, thought Smiley. He took from it a plain buff folder and handed it to Smiley. Facsimile of the letter. Supers had to give you a copy. They're sending the original to UFO, another straight to Marlene Dietrich. Who the devil's she? Sorry, sir. What we call your advisor, sir. Pretty general in the branch, sir. Very sorry, sir. How beautiful, thought Smiley. How absolutely beautiful. He opened the folder and looked at the facsimile. Mendel went on talking. First suicide letter I've ever seen that was typed. First one I've seen with a time on it, for that matter. Signature looks okay, though. Checked in at the station against the receipt it once signed for lost property. Right as rain. The letter was typed, probably a portable. Like the anonymous denunciation, that was a portable too. This one was signed with Fennon's neat, legible signature. Beneath the printed address at the head of the page was typed the date, and beneath that, the time. 10:30 p.m. Dear Sir David, after some hesitation, I have decided to take my life. I cannot depend my remaining years under a cloud of disloyalty and suspicion. I realize that my career is ruined, and that I am the victim of paid informers. Yours sincerely, Samuel Fenton. Smiley read it through several times. His mouth pursed in concentration, his eyebrows raised a little as if in surprise. Mendel was asking him something. How do you get onto it? Onto what? This early call business. Oh, I took the call. Thought it was for me. It wasn't. It was the exchange with this thing. Even then, the penny didn't drop. I assumed it was for her, you see. Went down and told her. Down? Yes. They keep the telephone in the bedroom. It's a sort of bed-sitter, really. She used to be an invalid, you know, and they've left the room as it was then, I suppose. Like a study. One end, books, typewriter, desk, and so forth. Typewriter? Yes. A portable. I imagine he did this letter on it. But you see, when I took that call, I'd forgotten it couldn't possibly be Mrs. Fenton who'd asked for it. Why not? She's an insomniac, she told me. Made a sort of joke of it. I told her to get some rest, and she just said, my body and I must put up with one another 20 hours a day. We have lived longer than most people already. There was more of it, something about not enjoying the luxury of sleep. So, why should she want a call at 8:30? Why should anyone? It's damn nearly lunchtime. God help the civil service. Exactly. Puzzles me too. Foreign Office admittedly starts late, at 10 o'clock, I think. But even then, Fenton would be pushed to dress, shave, breakfast, and catch a train on time if he did wait till 8:30. Besides, his wife would call him. She might have been chewing a line about not sleeping, said Mendel. Women do, about insomnia and migraine and stuff. Makes people think they're nervous and temperamental. Cock, most of it. Smiley shook his head. No, she couldn't have made the call, could she? She wasn't home till 10:45. But even supposing she made a mistake about the time she got back, she couldn't have gone to the telephone without. Hello. Let's see. Smiley read it through several times, his mouth pursed in concentration, his eyebrows raised a little as if in surprise. Mendel was asking him something. Oh yeah, I read this. Where I was. Smiley shook his head. No, she couldn't have made the call, could she? She wasn't home till 10:45, but even supposing she made a mistake about the time she got back, she couldn't have gone to the telephone without seeing her husband's body first. One moment. What is going on here? Are you not going to tell me that her reaction on finding her husband dead was to go upstairs and ask for an early call? They drank their coffee in silence for a while. Nothing, said Mendel. Yes? His wife got back from the theatre at 10:45, yeah? That's what she says. Did she go alone? No idea. Bet she didn't. I bet she had to tell the truth then, turned the letter to give herself an alibi. Smiley's mind went back to Elsa Fenton, her anger, her submission. It seemed ridiculous to talk about her in this way. No, not Elsa Fenton. No. Where was the body found? Smiley asked. By the stairs. Bottom of the stairs? True. Sprawled across the hall floor, revolver underneath them. And the note? Where was that? Beside him on the floor. Anything else? Yes. A mug cocoa in the drawing room. I see. Fenton decides to commit suicide. He asks the exchange to ring him at 8:30. He makes himself some cocoa and puts it in the drawing room. He goes upstairs and types the last letter. He comes down again to shoot himself, leaving the cocoa undrunk. It all hangs together nicely. Yes, doesn't it? Incidentally, aren't you a better ring your office? He looked at Mendel equivocally. That's the end of our beautiful friendship, he said. As he walked towards the coin box beside the door marked private, he heard Mendel saying, I bet you say that to all the boys. He was actually smiling as he asked for Maston's number. Maston wanted to see him at once. He went back to the table. Mendel was stirring another cup of coffee as it required all of his concentration. He was eating a very large bun. Smiley stood beside him. I've got to go back to London. Well, this will put the cat among the pigeons. The weasel face turned abruptly towards him. Or will it? He spoke at the front of his mouth while the back of it continued to deal with the bun. If Fenton was murdered, no power on earth can prevent the press from getting hold of the story. And to himself he added, I don't think Maston would like that. He'd prefer suicide. Still, we got to face that, haven't we? Smiley paused, frowning earnestly. Already he could hear Maston deriding his suspicions, laughing them impatiently away. I don't know, he said. I really don't know. Back to London, he thought. Back to Maston's ideal home, back to the rat race of blame, and back to the unreality of containing a human tragedy in a 3-part report. It was raining again, a warm, incessant rain now, and the short distance between the Fountain Cafe and the police station he got very wet. He took off his coat and threw it in the back of the car. It was a relief to be leaving Wollaston, even for London. As he turned on to the main road, he saw out at the corner of his eye the figure of Mendel stoically trudging along the pavement towards the station, his grey trilby shapeless and blackened by the rain. It hadn't occurred to Smiley that he might want a lift to London, and he felt ungracious. Mendel, untroubled by the niceties of the situation, opened the passenger door and got in. Bit of luck, he observed. Hate trains. Cambridge Circus, you going to? You drop me Westminster, by the way, can't you? They set off, when Mendel produced a shabby green tobacco tin and rolled himself a cigarette. He directed it towards his mouth, changing his mind, and offered it to Smiley, lighting it for him with an extraordinary lighter that threw a 2-inch blue flame. "You look worried sick," said Mendel. "I am." There was a pause. Mendel said, "It's the devil you don't know that's get to you." They had driven another 4 or 5 miles when Smiley drew the car into the side of the road. He turned to Mendel. "Would you mind awfully if we drove back to Wollaston?" "Good idea. Go and ask her." He turned the car and drove slowly back to Wollaston, back to Meredale Lane. He left Mendel in the car and walked down the familiar gravel path. She opened the door and showed him into the drawing room without a word. She was wearing the same dress, and Smiley wondered how she had passed the time since he had left her that morning. Had she been walking about the house, or sitting motionless in the drawing room, or upstairs in the bedroom with the leather chairs? How did she see herself in her new widowhood? Could she take it seriously yet? Was she still in that secretly elevated state which immediately follows bereavement? Still looking at herself in the mirrors, trying to discern the change, the horror in her own face, and weeping when she could not? Neither of them sat down. Both instinctively avoided the repetition of that morning's greeting. "There was one thing I felt I must ask you, Mrs. Fenton. I'm very sorry to have bothered you again." "About the call, I expect. The early morning call from the exchange." "Yes." "I thought that might puzzle you. An insomniac asks for early morning call." She's trying to speak brightly. "Yes, it did seem odd. Do you often go to the theatre?" "Yes, once a fortnight. I am a member of the Weybridge Repertory Club, you know. I try to go to everything they do. I have a seat reserved for me automatically on the first Tuesday of each run. My husband worked late on Tuesdays. He never came, and they go to classical theatre." "But he liked Brecht, didn't he? He seemed very thrilled with the Berliner ensemble performances in London." She looked at him for a moment, and then smiled suddenly. The first time he had seen her do so. It was an enchanting smile. Her whole face lit up like a child's. Smiley had a fleeting vision of Elsa Fenton as a child, a spindly, agile tomboy like George Sand's Petite Vedette, half woman, half glib, lying girl. He saw her as a wheedling backfish, fighting like a cat for herself alone, and he saw her, too, starved and shrunken in prison camp, ruthless in a fight for self-preservation. It was so pathetic to witness in that smile the light of her early innocence, and a steeled weapon in a fight for survival. "I'm afraid the explanation of that call is very silly," she said. "I suffer from a terrible memory. Really awful. Go shopping and forget I've come to buy. Make an appointment on the telephone and forget in the moment I replace the receiver. I ask people to stay the weekend. We're out when they arrive. Occasionally, when there is something I simply have to remember, I ring the exchange and ask for a call a few minutes before the appointing time. It's like a knot in one's handkerchief, but a knot can't ring a bell at you, can it?" Smiley peered at her. Her throat felt rather dry, and he had to swallow before he spoke. "And what was the call for this time, Mrs. Fenton?" Again, the enchanting smile. "There you are. I completely forget." 5. Maston and Candlelight. As he drove slowly back towards London, Smiley ceased to be conscious of Mendel's presence. There had been a time when the mere business of driving a car was a relief to him, when he found in the unreality of a long, solitary journey a palliative to his troubled brain, when the fatigue of several hours driving had allowed him to forget more sombre cares. It was one of the subtler landmarks of middle age, perhaps, that he could no longer thus subdue his mind. It needed sterner measures now. He even tried on occasion to plan in his head a walk through a European city, to record the shops and buildings he would pass, for instance, in Berna on a walk from Munster to the university. But despite such energetic mental exercise, the ghosts of time present would intrude and drive his dreams away. It was Anne who had robbed him of his peace, Anne who had once made the present so important and taught him the habit of reality, and when she went there was nothing. He could not believe that Elsa Fennan had killed her husband. Her instinct was to defend, to hoard the treasures of her life, to build about herself the symbols of normal existence. There was no aggression in her, no will, but the will to preserve. But who could tell? What did Hesse write? Strange to wander in the mist, each is alone. No tree knows his neighbour, each is alone. We know nothing of one another. Nothing, Smiley mused. However closely we live together, whatever time of day or night we sound the deepest thoughts of one another, we know nothing. How am I judging Elsa Fennan? I think I understand her suffering and her frightened lies, but what do I know of her? Nothing. Manda was pointing at a signpost. That's where I live, Mitcham. Not a bad spot, really. Got sick of a bachelor quarters. Bought a decent, semi-detached down here for my retirement. Retirement? It's a long way off. Yes, 3 days. That's why I got this job. Nothing to it. No complications. Give it to old Mendel who'll muck it up. Well, I expect we shall both be out of the job by Monday. He drove Mendel to Scotland Yard and went on to Cambridge Circus. He realised as he walked into the building that everyone knew. It was the way they looked, some shade of difference in their glance, their attitude. He made straight for Maston's room. Maston's secretary was at the desk, and she looked up quickly as he entered. Advisor in? Yes. He's expecting you. He's alone. I should knock and go in. You should. But Maston had opened the door and was already calling him. He was wearing a black coat and pinstripe trousers. There goes a cabaret, thought Smiley. I've been trying to get in touch with you. Did you not receive my message? Said Maston. I did, but I couldn't possibly have spoken to you. I don't quite follow? Well, I don't believe Fennan committed suicide. I think he was murdered. I could say that on the telephone. I couldn't say that on the telephone. Maston took off his spectacles and looked at Smiley in blank astonishment. Murdered? Why? Well, Fennan wrote his letter at 10:30 last night, if we were to accept the time on his letter as correct. Well, at 7:55, he rang up the exchange and asked to be called at 8:30 the next morning. How on earth do you know that? I was there this morning when the exchange rang. I took the call thinking it might be from the department. How could you possibly say that it was Fennan who ordered the call? I had enquiries made. The girl at the exchange knew Fennan's voice well. She was sure it was he, and that he rang at 7:55 last night. Fenn and the girl knew each other, did they? Good heavens, no. They just exchanged pleasantries occasionally. And how do you conclude from this that he was murdered? Well, I asked his wife about this call, and she lied. She said she ordered it herself. She claimed to be frightfully absent-minded. She gets the exchange to ring her occasionally like a tying a knot in a handkerchief when she has an important appointment. And another thing, just before shooting himself he made some cocoa. He never drank it. Maston listened in silence. At last he smiled and got up. We seem to be at cross purposes, he said. I sent you down to discover why Fenton shot himself. You come back and say he didn't. We're not policemen, Smiley. No. I sometimes wonder what we are. Did you hear of anything that affects our position here? Anything that explains his action at all? Anything to substantiate the suicide letter? Smiley hesitated before replying. He had seen it coming. Yes, I understood from Mrs. Fenton that her husband was very upset after the interview. He might as well hear the whole story. It obsessed him. He couldn't sleep after it. She had to give him a sedative. Her account of Fenton's reaction to my interview entirely substantiates the letter. He was silent for a minute, blinking rather stupidly before him. What I'm trying to say is that I don't believe her. I don't believe Fenton wrote the letter, or that he had any intention of dying. He returned to Maston. We simply cannot dismiss the inconsistencies. Another thing, he plunged on. I haven't had an expert's comparison made, but there's a similarity between the anonymous letter and Fenton's suicide note. The type looks identical. It's ridiculous, I know, but there it is. We must bring the police in. Give them the facts. Facts? Said Maston. What facts? Suppose she did lie. She's an odd woman by all accounts, foreign Jewish. Heaven knows the tributaries of her mind. I am told she suffered in the war, persecuted and so forth. She may see you in the oppressor, the inquisitor. She spots you onto doing something, panics and tells you the first lie that comes into her head. Does that make her a murderess? Then why did Fenton make the call? Why make himself a nightcap? Who can tell? Maston's voice was richer now, more persuasive. If you or I, Smiley, were ever driven to that dreadful point where we're determined to destroy ourselves, who can tell what our last thought on earth would be? And what's of Fenton? He sees his career in ruins. His life has no meaning. Is it not conceivable that he should wish in a moment of weakness or irresolution to hear another human voice, to feel again the warmth of human contact before he dies? Fanciful, sentimental perhaps, but not improbable in a man so overwrought, so obsessed that he takes his own life. Smiley had to give him credit. It was a good performance, and he was no match for Maston when it came to this. Abruptly, he felt inside himself the rising panic of frustration beyond endurance. With panic came an uncontrollable fury with his